The emergency room lights died without warning. 3 seconds of absolute black. And when the fluorescents hammered back on, there she was. A small, quiet nurse standing over a dying four-star general with both hands buried inside his throat, blood soaking her sleeves to the elbow, working with a calm that didn't belong in any hospital. It didn't belong anywhere a civilian should have learned. The soldiers who had carried him in were frozen against the walls. Then one of them, a staff sergeant with a shattered arm still wrapped against his chest, straightened his spine and saluted her. The others followed, one by one, without a word. Nobody in that room understood why. Not yet. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow me right now, hit like, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it started. Her name was Sara Malone, and for 11 months she had been the most invisible person at Halcyon General Medical Center in the city of Delwick. Not invisible in the way that people ignore you at a party. Invisible in the way that people look directly at you and still manage not to see you, registering only what they need to dismiss you and moving on. She was 34 years old, white, medium height, with a face that strangers described later as pleasant or forgettable. And she moved through the trauma wing with the kind of deliberate quietness that some people mistook for timidity, and others just mistook for being slow. She was neither, but nobody at Halcyon General had bothered to find that out. The trauma wing operated under the authority of Dr. Marcus Holt, a board-certified cardiovascular and trauma surgeon who had trained at Johns Hopkins, published in 3 different peer-reviewed journals, and made absolutely sure that everyone within a 50-foot radius knew both of those things at all times. He was tall, broad-shouldered, telegenic in a way that impressed hospital administrators and intimidated everyone beneath him, which was, in his estimation, most people. He had decided Sara Malone was incompetent within the first week of her hire. She couldn't remember what she'd done to earn that verdict. She had shown up on time, she had done the work, she had not argued with anyone. Somewhere in that sequence something had offended him, and after that the dynamic had been set in stone. Malone. He'd said her name the way you'd say the name of a piece of furniture you kept bumping into. Why is this patient's pain medication still pending? Did you forget how to use the system, or did you just decide your time was more valuable than his comfort? The pharmacy flagged a dosage conflict, Sara said. I sent it back for review at 11:40. It came back cleared 4 minutes ago. I'm entering it now. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, seeming annoyed that she had an answer, and then walked away without acknowledging it. This was how their exchanges went. She had stopped expecting anything different. The rest of the ward staff had taken its cues from Marcus, the way staff always takes its cues from the surgeon who controls the schedule. Yvonne Tran, the charge nurse, assigned Sara the worst shifts. The overnight doubles, the back-to-back holiday weekends, the floater days that meant being pulled in 6 directions by 6 different departments with no continuity and no credit. Tran wasn't cruel exactly. She was efficient, and Sara had become the path of least resistance because Sara didn't complain. Other nurses did. Sara didn't. She filed her notes, restocked her carts, checked her patients' lines, and went home to a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of Delwick that was not dangerous, but was not particularly anything else either. She had a second-hand couch and a coffee maker she'd had for 9 years, and a small cactus on the windowsill that she watered irregularly, and which appeared to be thriving specifically because of the neglect. Her neighbor, a retired postal worker named Gus Abernethy, had once knocked on her door to borrow a wrench and ended up staying for 40 minutes talking about his daughter's school play. He told her later that she was a good listener. "You've got one of those faces," he said, "like nothing you say is going to surprise you." Sara had smiled at that and handed him a cup of coffee and said nothing, which probably proved his point. She had been in Delwick for just under a year. Before Delwick, she had been in Sutter Point. Before Sutter Point, she had been somewhere she didn't talk about. She had learned to stop talking about it a long time ago. The morning that everything changed started like most mornings at Halcyon General. Understaffed, overlit, and already 3 incidents behind by 7 a.m. A 42-year-old came in with chest pain that turned out to be cardiac. A teenager arrived seizing. 2 car accident victims showed up simultaneously, which triggered a minor surge protocol that the charge desk handled by pulling every available body into the trauma bay and leaving the overflow ward essentially unmanned. Sara managed 4 patients alone for 90 minutes. caught a medication error on a post-op patient in room 9 that could have turned serious, documented everything, and did not mention it to anyone because mentioning it would have required explaining why she'd been in that room in the first place, which would have led to a conversation about resource allocation that would have gone nowhere productive and taken time she didn't have. At 9:15, she was in the supply corridor refilling an IV cart when she heard Yvonne's voice from the charge desk, tight with the specific kind of tension that meant someone above Tran's pay grade was unhappy. "What do you mean the certification records are missing?" Sara stopped refilling and listened without moving. "The Joint Commission auditors want the continuing education files for 6 nurses by end of day Thursday." A pause. "Yes, I know. I'll find them." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying I can't locate them." Sara went back to the cart. An hour later, Tran found her in the break room and said, without preamble, "I need your CE records going back 18 months. I'll pull them tonight. I need them by Wednesday morning." "Okay." Tran studied her for a moment, as though waiting for the argument that didn't come. Then she left. Sara sat with her coffee and thought about 18 months of records, which were, in fact, complete and organized in a folder on her personal laptop because she had always kept careful records of everything. Not because she expected to need them, just because she had learned early that you could not count on anyone else to keep proof of who you were. That lesson had come from a place that had nothing to do with nursing. She thought about that place sometimes. In the break room and in the supply corridor and in the quiet of her apartment at 2 in the morning when the cactus sat on the sill and the city outside made its distant sounds. She thought about red dust and heat and the particular smell of a field trauma kit opened under pressure. She thought about voices giving orders in the dark. She thought about the sound of a rotor blade descending. She never thought about it for too long. She had gotten good at that, at cutting the memory off at a certain point and folding it back down like a map you no longer need. She had gotten professional level good at it. This was, she sometimes thought, the only skill from her previous life that she used every day at Halcyon General. Marcus Holt found a new angle 3 weeks later. The hospital had recently invested in a rapid sequence intubation protocol update, a streamlined procedure meant to standardize how the trauma team handled difficult airways under pressure. There was mandatory training, there was a skills assessment. There were, as always, forms. Marcus ran the assessment himself, which was unnecessary given his seniority, but he enjoyed the performance of competence in front of junior staff. He watched Sara during the simulation. She did fine. Better than fine, technically, but she completed the procedure with a stillness and efficiency that made her look, if anything, too comfortable. And Marcus had a category in his head for people who looked too comfortable doing something they shouldn't have been trained to do, and the category was labeled problem. "Malone," he said afterward, in front of 4 other nurses and a first-year resident who went very still the way residents do when a senior physician singles someone out. "How many RSI procedures have you assisted with in an actual emergency setting?" "A few," she said. "A few." He repeated it back with the particular inflection that makes 2 words sound like an accusation. "Because your technique looked practiced, not textbook practiced. The other kind. I've done continuing ed." He clicked his pen and made a note that probably said nothing in particular, but the act of writing it said plenty. "I'll want to review that." The resident looked at the floor. The other nurses looked at the wall. Sara looked at Marcus and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because she understood exactly what was happening and understood equally that naming it would make it worse. She went back to work. It was a Tuesday in March when the first military vehicle came through the Delwick city limits. Not unusual, in isolation. Fort Garron sat 40 miles east of the city, and military traffic moved through on training rotations, logistics runs, supply convoys. Nobody paid particular attention to the 2-vehicle escort that rolled down the Delwick bypass that morning, or to the 6-vehicle convoy that followed it an hour later. The explosion happened at 11:47 a.m. Sara was in the middle of a dressing change when the sound hit the building. Not a bang so much as a compression, a physical thing that pushed through the walls and made the IV bags sway on their poles and made every person in the ward go quiet for one collective second before the radio traffic started and the phone at the charge desk lit up and Tran's voice cut through the hall at a volume Sara had never heard from her. "Trauma protocol. All hands. Now. The next 4 minutes were organized chaos. The kind that looks like disarray, but is actually a practice sequence of actions that hospital staff run so many times in drills that the body takes over when the real thing arrives. Bays were cleared, crash carts were positioned. The on-call surgical team got paged. The charge desk called in off-duty staff. Sara tied off the dressing she was working on, told her patient she'd be back, and moved to the trauma bay. The first ambulance arrived at 11:53, then the second, then two more simultaneously, which was when the system started to strain at the seams because Halcyon General's trauma capacity was rated for a surge, not for a mass casualty incident, and what was coming through those doors was something in between. Enough to overwhelm, not enough to trigger the full regional protocol that would bring backup from Mercy Central and St. Edith's across town. Marcus was in the bay. He looked for the first time since Sara had worked under him, slightly frightened. Not visibly, not in any way he would have allowed anyone to name, but the set of his jaw was different, and he was moving between patients faster than usual, which meant he wasn't settling into the deliberate authority he usually wore like a second set of scrubs. He was managing, but he was not leading. The soldiers coming in were in bad shape, two with blast injuries, shrapnel patterns across the torso and upper extremities. One with a femoral bleed that the field medic had already tourniqueted but which was going to need surgical intervention fast. A fourth with what looked like a compression injury to the chest, ribs and lung, possibly cardiac involvement. The medics who had ridden in with them were trying to hand off verbal reports to whoever would stop long enough to receive them, and the noise level in the bay was climbing past the point where clear communication was easy. Sara took the handoff from a young Army medic, specialist, by the rank on his sleeve, mid-20s, hands steady, but eyes wide, and listened to his report with her attention locked on the chest injury patient while she ran her own visual assessment. GSW or blast fragment to the upper left thorax, the specialist said. Breath sounds diminished on the left. BP was 84/60 in transport, came back up to 91, but it's not holding. SATs are 88, Sara said, reading the monitor the respiratory tech had just connected. Yes, ma'am. She pulled on gloves. When did you place that chest seal? About 22 minutes out, it vented twice in transport. She was already palpating the chest wall, running her fingers along the rib line. Deviated trachea? The specialist blinked. Slight right deviation, yes. How did you... Tension pneumo, she said, not loudly, not performing for the room, just stating it. We need to decompress, now. The resident who had been assigned to this patient, second year, name tag said Kelsey Park, looked at Sara with the expression of someone who knows the right answer and is waiting for permission from the right person to say it. Marcus was across the bay, occupied with the femoral bleed. Dr. Holt, Sara called. Busy. He didn't look up. Tension pneumo in Bay 3. Patient is decompensating. Then decompress him. That's a physician order. Marcus glanced up, made a sound of irritated concession, and called across the bay. Park, needle decompression. Bay 3, authorized. Park moved. Sara was already positioned, and when Park hesitated for a fraction of a second on placement, the angle slightly off, the uncertainty visible in her wrist, Sara didn't take over. She put 2 fingers on Park's hand and adjusted the angle without a word. The needle went in correctly. The patient's blood pressure started climbing within 90 seconds. Park exhaled. Sara moved to the next patient. But they were 20 minutes into the surge when the last ambulance arrived. She almost didn't notice at first, but the bay was at capacity. She was managing a septic transition between the blast patients and one of the original morning admits who had been displaced by the surge and was now declining in a side room without anyone checking on her, and Sara had been doing 3 things simultaneously for the past quarter hour. But the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, and she registered it the way you register a change in air pressure. Not consciously, not in words, but in the body. A different quality of attention. The military personnel near the entrance standing differently. She turned. The gurney coming through the doors was surrounded by a security detail that had no business being inside a civilian hospital trauma bay. 2 soldiers in dress uniform, 3 in tactical gear, 1 man in a suit who was speaking quietly into a phone. The paramedics pushing the gurney were moving fast and were clearly spooked, and the patient on the gurney was an older man, large frame, silver hair. in a military uniform that was badly torn on the left side and soaked through with blood from the shoulder to the hip. The rank insignia on the torn collar was visible even from across the bay. 4 stars. Sara went very still. Marcus had seen it too. He came to the gurney fast, reverting to the version of himself that existed for high-visibility moments. Authoritative, loud, filling space. What are we working with? The paramedic leading the gurney rattled the report. General Whitmore, 4-star, blast concussion, suspected internal hemorrhage left flank, BP is falling. We had him at 90/60, now 82. He's been in and out of consciousness. Get him to Trauma 1, Marcus said. Park, get OR 2 on the line. Malone? He didn't finish the sentence. He'd already moved on, which was his way of assigning her without assigning her, leaving her to fill in the gap he'd created. She took her position at the head of the gurney. The general's eyes were open, not fully, the kind of partial consciousness that comes and goes, where the person is present in flashes but not reliably. He was breathing, but the quality of it was wrong. Too shallow. Too fast. Sara checked the airway, leaned in, ran the assessment in 4 seconds that felt like 1. His breathing is laboring, she said to Marcus. He's maintaining. For now. Then let's get him stable and let OR handle it. She straightened and said nothing. Marcus moved around the gurney to review the monitor readouts, and the room compressed into the specific busyness of a major trauma receiving, which means movement and noise and a dozen tasks happening at once, and the sense that there is no single person in charge, but that somehow collectively enough things are happening to keep the patient alive. General Whitmore's eyes moved, unfocused, then, for 3 seconds, focused. On her. Sara was checking his airway again. She didn't notice immediately. When she looked up, his eyes were already drifting, and she couldn't tell if what she'd seen was recognition or just the random firing of a half-conscious brain landing on the nearest face. She went back to work. 6 minutes later, the monitors changed. "Sat's dropping," the tech called. 89, 87. "Airway's compromising," Sara said. Marcus was at the light board reviewing imaging that had just come up. "What?" "He's losing the airway. The swelling around the left throat structures. It's been building. It's going to close." He was maintaining, but he isn't anymore. She kept her voice level. "We need to intubate." Marcus came to the bedside, looked at the monitor, looked at the general's face, made the assessment that she had already made 30 seconds earlier. "Okay, RSI, get the kit." The kit was in her hands. Park was on the other side of the gurney. The respiratory tech was positioning. The room narrowed to the specific focus of an airway emergency, which is a particular kind of calm inside chaos that people who have only worked in hospitals sometimes mistake for confidence, and people who have worked in other places recognize as something else. Marcus took the laryngoscope. He made the attempt. Then he made it again. "Cords are displaced," he said. The first time his voice had the quality of someone narrating a procedure. The second time, it had a different quality. "Can't visualize. Someone get suction." Suction. More suctioning. A third attempt. The monitor alarmed. "Sat's at 79, the tech said. "I can't get the angle." Sara had already moved. Not aggressively. Not in a way that pushed Marcus aside or made a performance of replacing him. She simply stepped into the space that needed to be filled, because the space needed to be filled, and the patient's oxygen saturation was at 79% and falling, and there was no version of the next 90 seconds that included waiting for the hierarchy to sort itself out. "Let me," she said. Marcus turned to her with an expression that started as irritation and became something else when he saw her face. Not her face exactly, but the quality behind it, the particular absence of hesitation. He stepped back, not generously, but he stepped back. Sara took the laryngoscope. Her left hand found the angle, a modified approach, blade slightly rotated, pressure applied with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from simulation labs and doesn't come from 10 years of hospital nursing. And in one motion, she visualized the cords and passed the tube. Confirmation. Breath sounds bilateral. Sat's climbing. 79, 83, 88. The room exhaled as a unit. Sara secured the tube, stepped back, stripped one glove. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at anyone. She moved to document, because that was the next task. And doing the next task was how she had always managed the moments after she did something that revealed more than she intended. But the room was doing the thing rooms do after something happens that doesn't fit their category system. The military medics near the door were looking at each other. The security detail in the hall had gone quiet. Specialist Park, who had been watching from the foot of the gurney, was staring at Sara with an expression that had passed through confusion and arrived somewhere closer to recalibration. And the man on the gurney, General Whitmore, 4 stars. Blood pressure climbing back into a stable range, oxygen saturation at 94 and rising, opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head slowly and found her. His voice was rough. Barely audible through the tube wasn't possible, but the tube hadn't been there long enough to fully depress the reflexive attempt to speak, and what came out was broken and wet and almost incomprehensible. But Sara heard it. 2 words. Just 2 words, shaped by a throat that had nearly closed forever, directed at the quiet nurse standing at the documentation station with one glove off and blood on her sleeve and her eyes already on the chart. She didn't turn around. Her hand kept moving across the tablet screen, but her jaw tightened, just slightly, just for a second, in the way that a person's jaw tightens when they hear something they have been dreading from a very specific direction for a very long time. The specialist near the door had heard it too. He took a step forward, looked at Sara, looked at the general, back at Sara. "Ma'am," he said. She didn't answer. "Ma'am?" His voice was different this time. "Did the general just call you?" "He's disoriented," Sara said. "Hypoxia does that. Document the intubation time and get me an updated BP." The specialist didn't move. Behind him, one of the soldiers in tactical gear had straightened in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with recognition. He was looking at Sara the way you look at something you didn't expect to see in a place it shouldn't be, the way you look at something you thought was gone. The fluorescence hummed overhead. Across the bay, Marcus Holt was talking to someone on his phone, his back to the room, apparently unaware that the atmosphere behind him had shifted into something he would not have had a category for. Sara set down the tablet. She turned and walked to the medication station, where she needed to check a drug order for Bay 2, because that was the next task, and the next task was what mattered. Her hands were steady, her face was entirely still, and in the doorway of Trauma Bay 1, a decorated combat specialist from Fort Garron stood with his uninjured arm beginning to rise in a salute he hadn't made a conscious decision to give, his body acting on a recognition that his brain was still catching up to. General Whitmore's hand lifted from the gurney, shaking, barely controlled, but pointed directly at the quiet woman with blood on her sleeves who was now checking a drug chart at the far end of the room as though none of it had happened. His lips moved again. This time 3 people heard it, and this time there was no possibility of calling it disorientation. His lips moved again. This time 3 people heard it, and this time there was no possibility of calling it disorientation. The name the general said was Sara, not Nurse Malone, not, "Hey, you," not the flattened transactional address that everyone at Halcyon General used when they needed something from her and didn't particularly care what her name was. He said Sara, the way you say a name you've carried in your memory for years, carefully, like setting something fragile back down on a shelf. And then he said the second part. "Captain." The word landed in the trauma bay the way a stone lands in still water, not loudly, but with a displacement that spread outward in every direction. Specialist Devin Okafor, standing near the door with his arm still half raised, heard it and let the salute finish. Not consciously. The way a reflex finishes. His spine was straight and his chin was level and his right hand was at his temple before he had made a single deliberate decision to put it there. The soldier in tactical gear, Sergeant Willa Pruitt, though Sara didn't know her name yet, took one step forward and stopped. Her expression had done 3 things in about 2 seconds. Surprise. Reassessment. Something that landed finally in the neighborhood of cautious, careful respect. Sara did not turn around. She was at the medication station with her back to the room, and she kept her eyes on the chart, and she held the tablet in both hands with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has learned to perform stillness as an act of will rather than an expression of actual calm. Her neck was tight. She could feel that. The tendons along her left shoulder were doing the thing they did when she was suppressing an instinct to move. The old habit, the pre-hospital habit, the one she had spent 4 years burying under routine and paperwork and the beige anonymity of civilian life. "Ma'am?" Okafor's voice was quiet, careful, like he wasn't sure what he was approaching. She turned. She had taken long enough to turn that her face was composed by the time she was facing him. She looked at him the same way she looked at anyone who needed something from her in this department: present, attentive, professionally neutral. "He needs rest," she said. "Whatever he thinks he remembers, he was hypoxic for—" "He remembers fine," Okafor said. He wasn't being aggressive. He was just being honest, which was somehow more difficult to deflect. "Ma'am, if you are who he thinks you are, I'm the nurse who intubated him. That's all." Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her hands. She had been aware for the past 60 seconds that her hands were a problem. Not because they were shaking. They weren't. Because they weren't. Most people's hands trembled after an emergency airway procedure on a 4-star general under surge conditions with the room watching. Her hands were completely still, resting against the edge of the medication station with the loose, recovered composure of someone who had done this too many times in too many worse places to be rattled by a hospital trauma bay. "That's all," she said again. Okafor dropped his salute slowly. He didn't look convinced, but he stepped back. Across the bay, Marcus had ended his call. He was watching the scene near the medication station with the expression of a man who has just realized something is happening that he doesn't have the right frame for. He looked at Okafor. He looked at Sara. He looked at the man on the gurney who had lowered his shaking hand but whose eyes were still tracking Sara's position in the room with the fixed, determined attention of someone who had not survived 40 years in uniform by letting important things out of his sight. "Malone," Marcus's voice had a particular flatness. "Can you explain what's happening over there?" "Nothing, Dr. Holt. I was checking the fentanyl order for Bay 2. "I'm not asking about the fentanyl order." She held his gaze. "Then I'm not sure what you're asking." A muscle in his jaw worked. He wasn't used to not being sure what he was asking. He opened his mouth to say something else. And that was the moment the trauma bay doors opened again, and two things happened simultaneously. A hospital administrator in a pressed blue blazer came in from the administrative corridor, and the man in the suit from the general security detail came in from the ambulance bay. The administrator was named Brenda Quarles, VP of Clinical Operations, and she had the look of someone who had been reaching a sustained simmer since the moment the mass casualty alert went out and was now very close to the boiling point. She went directly to Marcus. The man in the suit went directly to Okafor, and they exchanged 6 words in a low voice, and then the man in the suit looked at Sara with the particular expression of someone who has just been briefed on a situation that is slightly larger and more complicated than the building they're currently standing in. Sara went back to the fentanyl order. The surge wrapped down over the next hour in the incremental, uneven way that surges always did. Patients stabilized or transferred, overflow managed, the adrenaline chemistry of the department gradually metabolizing into exhaustion and the low-grade friction that comes after high-stakes situations when people start processing what happened and assigning meaning to it. General Whitmore was moved to the surgical ICU. The man in the suit, his name, Sara later learned, was Carver, no first name offered, had a conversation with Quarles that lasted 11 minutes in the hallway outside the administrative offices, and that Quarles came out of looking like she had swallowed something that disagreed with her. Sara learned most of this secondhand, pieced together from the fragments of conversation that moved through the nursing staff, the way information always moved through nursing staff, laterally, fast, and with a detail-to-accuracy ratio that was approximately 60% reliable. What she knew for certain was what she had seen herself. And what she had seen herself was enough to understand that the thing she had been careful not to become had become itself anyway. Right here in this fluorescent-lit trauma bay in the middle of a Tuesday, through no action she had taken except the one that had mattered most. She finished her shift. She documented everything that needed to be documented. She did a handoff with the night-charge nurse. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room and put on her jacket and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the parking level. The elevator opened. Okafor was standing in the lobby. He was not in a position that suggested he was waiting for the elevator. He was standing against the far wall near the information desk with a coffee cup he wasn't drinking, and when the elevator opened and Sara stepped out, he turned with the body language of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. She stopped, looked at him. I'm not trying to cause you a problem, he said. I know. General Whitmore is asking for you. I'm off shift. I know that too. He paused. He was about 26, 27, with the particular brand of earnestness that belonged to soldiers who had not yet had all of it weathered out of them. He's been asking since they moved him upstairs. He's asking by name. Your full name. A beat. Your other full name. Sara looked at the lobby floor, the composite tile, the scuff marks from 100,000 shoe soles. He's confused, she said, knowing she'd already lost the ground that sentence was supposed to defend. He's not confused. Okafor's voice wasn't unkind. I served under him for 3 years. When he's confused, everyone knows it. Right now he's very clear. He told me to tell you. He stopped, reconsidered. He said to tell you that it was Ramirez's team, that's all. Just that. He said you'd know what it meant. Sara went very still. The lobby sounds continued around her. The low hum of the facility, a distant PA page, the swish of the automatic doors opening for a family coming in from the parking structure. None of it touched her. Ramirez's team. She knew exactly what it meant. Tell him I'll come up in the morning, she said. He said tonight. She almost said something sharp. She could feel the shape of it in her throat. Instead, she looked at Okafor again. At the genuine, uncomplicated worry in his face, the way he was holding his coffee cup without drinking it, the way he was standing in a hospital lobby at 9 in the evening because a general had asked him to find someone, and he was the kind of person who did what was asked of him without requiring it to be convenient. Give me 10 minutes, she said. The surgical ICU was a different world from the trauma bay, quieter, dimmer, the machine speaking in steadier rhythms, the crisis replaced with the sustained, careful vigilance of serious recovery. The nurses here moved differently, less urgency, more precision. The patients here were past the moment of survival and into the long negotiation with their own bodies about what came next. Whitmore was in a private room, security outside. Carver in the hall, on another call, who looked at Sara when she arrived and made a gesture that might have been approval or might have been dismissal. She couldn't tell and didn't particularly try. The general was awake. He looked worse than he had in the trauma bay, in the way that serious patients always look worse once the machinery of crisis has stepped back and you can see the underlying damage clearly. He was large and pale, and the bandaging on his left side was substantial. His face had the particular gray quality of blood loss that hadn't fully been replaced yet. But his eyes were sharp. They were on her the moment the door opened. Close the door, he said. She did. She came to the bedside and stood there with her jacket still on, which was deliberate. She wasn't on duty. This was not a nursing visit, and she needed that line to be clear to both of them. General Whitmore, stop. His voice was rough from the tube. He'd been extubated 40 minutes ago, once he was stable enough. Don't do the nurse thing. Not right now. She said nothing. How long have you been here? He said. Not a question, exactly. 11 months. Here in Delwick. Yes. Before that? Sutter Point. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. And before that? She didn't answer. He didn't push it. He already knew the answer to the before that. He had probably known more about the before that than she realized, which was a thought she filed away for later. Ramirez's team was ambushed, he said. 8 months after you left, all 4 of them. We lost 3. Martinez survived. He's at Walter Reed. He paused. We suspected for a long time it wasn't random. Suspected, not confirmed. Another pause. Today's convoy wasn't random either. Sara felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite surprise. It was more like the sensation of a thing you've been braced for finally arriving, the removal of the suspense, which should feel like relief and doesn't. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because DCIS has been running a parallel investigation for 14 months. Defense Criminal Investigative Service. He looked at her directly. They've been looking for you. For me. To talk to you. Not about what you did. About what was done. He shifted against the pillow, winced with the control of a man who had been in pain enough times to have developed a relationship with it. Someone sold information about Ramirez's route. That same someone, or someone connected to them, had access to today's convoy schedule. This isn't coincidence, Sara. This is the same network. The room was quiet. Why me? She said. I've been out for 4 years. Because you were there when it started, he said. And because you apparently have not lost whatever it was that made you the best trauma surgeon in that unit. He looked at her hands again the way Okafor had, and unlike Okafor's assessment, which had been surprised, Whitmore's was something more like confirmation. You didn't hesitate tonight. I didn't have time to hesitate. That's exactly what I mean. He held her gaze. I need you to talk to the DCIS investigators. Not here, not tonight, but soon. And if I don't want to, it wasn't defiance, it was a real question, asked flatly. He was quiet for a moment. Then you don't, he said. You've already done enough, more than enough tonight. He paused. I just think you know what I know. What's that? That some things follow you, he said, whether you stop and face them or not. Sara looked at the monitors, the steady green lines of his heart, recovered and regular. She had put the tube in that had kept that heart supplied with oxygen long enough to get where it was now. She thought about Ramirez, about the 3 names she already knew, without being told, were the 3 who hadn't made it home. I'll talk to them, she said. She left without saying anything else. She found out the next morning that Marcus had filed a formal complaint. The complaint cited her for practicing outside her scope, specifically the emergency airway management the previous afternoon, which Marcus had in his written account described as a unilateral, unauthorized intervention by nursing staff in a physician-directed procedure. The language was precise and bureaucratic and managed, very skillfully, to make saving a man's life sound like a regulatory violation. Tran handed her the printed notification at 7:52 a.m. with the expression of someone who found the situation uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to say so out loud. It's a preliminary review, Tran said. You'll get a chance to respond. When? The board wants to meet Thursday. Sara took the paper, read it, folded it, and put it in her scrubs pocket. Okay, she said. Sara. Tran lowered her voice. A few people are saying, there's talk about what happened yesterday, about what the general said, and about... She stopped. You should know that not everyone is on Holt's side here. How many people? Tran hesitated. Some. Sara nodded and went to check on her first patient of the morning. The complaint was just a complaint. The board meeting was just a board meeting. She had been in situations in which paperwork was used as a weapon before, and she understood that the correct response was not to panic and not to fight the paper. The paper was just paper, but to stay level and wait for the thing underneath it to surface, because there was always a thing underneath it. What she hadn't anticipated was how fast the thing underneath would surface and how many people it would bring with it. The 2 investigators arrived at 11 a.m. They didn't come through the administrative entrance. They came through the main lobby, which was technically more efficient but also more visible, and Sara was pretty sure the visibility was deliberate. They were in civilian clothes, a man named Garrison and a woman named Patel, both mid-40s, both carrying the specific kind of unhurried precision that belonged to federal investigators who were not in a hurry because they had already done their preliminary work and knew most of what they were about to find. Quarles met them in the lobby. She walked them to the conference room on the 2nd floor with the expression of someone trying very hard to look like the situation was under control. Sara was paged to the conference room at 11:20. She walked in to find Quarles, Garrison, Patel, Carver, and a woman in Army service uniform she didn't recognize, who was a colonel by rank, and who was sitting at the far end of the table with a manila folder closed in front of her and a patience about her that suggested she had been waiting for this meeting for considerably longer than today. Marcus Holt was also in the room. He had not expected Sara to be there. His surprise was brief and quickly suppressed, but she saw it. She sat down. Garrison opened a folder. He didn't perform it. He just opened it and looked at it, and then looked at Sara the way investigators look at people they have already assessed, calmly, directly, with the particular lack of surprise that comes from knowing the shape of a thing before you're formally introduced to it. Ms. Malone, he said, or Captain Malone. We'll let you choose which one you prefer in this room. Marcus went very still. Quarles looked at Sara with an expression that had just turned into something more complicated than the administrative concern it had been a moment ago. Sara is fine, Sara said. Sara, Garrison nodded. We have some questions, and we have some information for you, which we'll share as we go. He glanced briefly at Marcus. Some of what we discuss may be unfamiliar to others in the room. I want to be clear up front that this meeting was requested by General Whitmore's office, coordinated with DCIS, and authorized at a level above this hospital's chain of command. Everyone present has the appropriate clearance or signed the appropriate NDA in the last 40 minutes. Marcus said, I haven't signed anything. You did, Patel said pleasantly, in the lobby. You may want to review the document. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Garrison turned back to Sara. Let's start with yesterday. Walk us through the procedure in Trauma Bay 1. Your words, your sequence. She walked them through it. She was factual and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She described what she had observed, what she had assessed, and what she had done in the order she had done it. She used the correct clinical terminology without making a performance of it. When she finished, Patel said, that approach, the modified blade rotation, is not standard civilian RSI protocol. No, Sara said. Where would a civilian nurse have learned it? They wouldn't. The room was very quiet. I'm not a civilian nurse, Sara said. Not originally. She looked at the colonel at the far end of the table, who had not spoken yet. I'm guessing Colonel Avery, the colonel said. Colonel Avery already has my file. Avery opened the manila folder without looking down at it. Army Captain Sara Malone, combat trauma surgeon, 2 deployments, certified in emergency surgery, advanced airway management, battlefield hemorrhage control, multiple commendations, assigned to a classified forward support unit operating in theater from... She looked down briefly. I'll stop there. She looked back up. You separated 4 years ago, under... A pause. Complicated circumstances. Disputed circumstances, Sara said. The first time her voice had any edge in it. Avery held her gaze. Noted. Marcus Holt had been listening with the expression of a man in the process of having a major assumption collapsed in slow motion. He had built a professional identity on a hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy was surgical expertise, which he had understood to be his particular distinction in this building. The idea that the woman he had been filing complaints against had been performing emergency surgery in active combat zones while he was doing his fellowship was visibly difficult for him to integrate. He tried anyway. None of this explains why she violated protocol. Garrison looked at him without hostility. Protocol exists to save lives, he said. General Whitmore is alive. We'll let the board make their determination, but I want to be clear about what the Department of Defense's assessment is, for the record. He looked at his folder. Outstanding intervention under pressure. We'll be submitting a commendation. She's a nurse, Marcus said, and heard immediately how it sounded. Nobody responded to that. The board met Thursday. Sara attended alone. No union rep. She had the right to one and declined it. No attorney. She walked in with the notification letter and her CE documentation and the intubation record from Tuesday and sat down across from 5 people, 2 of whom she could tell had already made up their minds before she sat down. What she hadn't expected was Garrison and Patel to be in the room, or Carver, or Colonel Avery, or Whitmore himself, appearing by video from the SYCU, pale, still bandaged, sitting up with the kind of ramrod posture that some people never fully surrender regardless of circumstance. On a laptop someone had propped on a rolling stand. We're not here to complicate the board's process, Garrison said, in an opening that was professional and pleasant, and that nonetheless managed to communicate very clearly that the process had already been complicated by the weight of what was in the room. We're here because several parties have a legitimate interest in the outcome of this review. Marcus Holt was also present. He had brought the hospital's legal counsel, the board chair, a man named Dressler, who had the energy of someone who had expected to spend Thursday adjudicating a fairly routine protocol dispute and had instead arrived to find a situation significantly outside his normal territory, asked everyone to present in order. Marcus presented first. He was composed. He cited the protocol. He described the procedure. He framed it as a matter of institutional standards and scope of practice, and he was careful, very careful, to avoid anything that could be characterized as personal, because he was smart enough to know that personal would damage him. Sara presented second. She said, "He was dying. I stopped that. The documentation supports the sequence. I'll answer any clinical questions the board has. Dressler asked 3. She answered 3, cleanly, precisely, without elaboration. Then Garrison spoke, and what Garrison laid out over the following 20 minutes was, in essence, Sara Malone's actual professional history. Not the nursing record, but the one before it. The commendations, the deployments, the specific procedures she had performed in theater that were in several cases more technically complex than the one she had performed Tuesday afternoon in the trauma bay. The assessment, formal and documented, from the Department of Defense, that her intervention had been not a protocol violation, but the application of a superior level of skill in a life-threatening emergency. Then Whitmore spoke from the screen. He spoke for 4 minutes. He was not eloquent. He was direct. He said that he was alive because of what Sara had done, that he had served with her in a capacity he could not fully detail in this room, but which had given him direct knowledge of her capabilities, and that the idea of the institution that had benefited from those capabilities, penalizing her for using them, was something he was prepared to oppose through whatever channels were available to him. He said that last part quietly. The room understood it. The board went into closed session. Sara waited in the hall with a paper cup of water she didn't drink. Okafor was sitting against the wall nearby, not because he was formally required to be there, but because he had apparently decided to be. And she didn't tell him to leave because she understood that some people express concern by being present, and you either accept it or you don't. She sat down next to him. They didn't talk. After 45 minutes, Dressler came out. He said the board had voted 3-2 to table the formal complaint pending completion of the DCIS review, and that Sara was to remain on administrative leave with full pay until that review concluded. He said it in the neutral tone of a man trying not to indicate which side of the 3-2 he had been on. She nodded. Okafor looked at her. "That's not a win," he said. "It's not a loss either." "They're stalling. They're scared," she said. "There's a difference." She stood up, threw the paper cup away, and walked to the elevator. What she was thinking about was not the board, and not Marcus, and not even Whitmore. She was thinking about something Garrison had said during the presentation that he hadn't given more than a sentence to, but which had been sitting in the back of her mind since the moment she heard it. He had said, the convoy's route data was accessed from a secure DoD logistics server 3 days before the attack. 3 days before the attack, there were 12 people in the country who had authorized access to that server. He hadn't said what the next sentence was, but he had paused after the 12 and looked at his folder, and the pause had the quality of a pause that is covering something specific rather than the generic pause of someone gathering their thoughts. Sara had 12 years of experience reading pauses. The elevator came. She stepped in and turned around and watched the doors close, and the pause was still there in her mind, sitting behind everything else, waiting. She had agreed to talk to the investigators. She had told Whitmore she would talk to them. She had done that. She had answered their questions and provided her account and done the institutional thing that institutional situations required. What she had not done was ask the question she had been turning over since Garrison mentioned the server. She had not asked who the 12th person was, because she thought she already knew, and she thought that Garrison, who had paused the way he paused, already knew that she knew. And she thought that whatever came next was not going to begin in a boardroom or a conference room or an elevator in a hospital in Delwick. She thought it was already happening somewhere she couldn't see yet, moving in a direction she hadn't fully mapped, and the only real question was whether it would reach her before she reached it. The elevator hit the ground floor. The doors opened. The lobby was ordinary. The automatic doors, the information desk, the families in the chairs, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon geography of a hospital that had no idea what was living inside it. Across the lobby, near the main entrance, a man was standing. She had never seen him before. He was watching the elevator. He was watching her. He turned and walked out before she could fully assess him. Coat, build, movement pattern, the particular angle of his shoulders, and the automatic doors closed behind him, and the lobby went back to being ordinary, and Sara stood very still for 3 seconds with her hand still touching the elevator frame. Then she took her hand away and walked in the opposite direction. She walked in the opposite direction. Not fast, not slow. The deliberate, unhurried pace of someone going somewhere specific, which she was not. She was going to the side corridor that connected the main lobby to the outpatient wing, because it had 2 exits and a camera blind spot between the elevator bank and the pharmacy window, And she knew the layout of this building the way she knew the layout of every building she'd spent significant time in, which was thoroughly and without having made a conscious decision to learn it. Old habit. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it activates. She reached the side corridor and stopped at the water fountain that didn't work properly. It never had. The pressure was always wrong, and 3 months ago she had mentioned it to facilities and nothing had happened. And she bent over it and let the weak stream run over her lip and used the 2 seconds of cover to check the reflection in the metal casing. The lobby behind her was ordinary. The man was gone. She stood up and kept walking. What she knew about the man was limited and probably incomplete. Coat, dark wool, not a hospital visitor's coat, which tended toward puffy synthetics or the light zip-up style of people who didn't plan to be outside long. Build, broad through the shoulders, which meant nothing by itself. Movement pattern, the specific thing she kept returning to, because his exit had been too controlled. Most people who feel seen in a lobby move with some acceleration, a flush of the caught-out instinct, even a small one. He had not accelerated. He had simply redirected cleanly the way you redirect when you are trained to redirect, and the doors had closed behind him with the casual authority of a man who had decided to leave, not a man who had been spooked into leaving. She filed it. She went to her car. She sat in the parking structure for 4 minutes without starting the engine, watching the entrance ramp in the rearview mirror, and when nothing came down, she drove to her apartment and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window with the cup in both hands looking at the street below while the cactus sat on the sill in its usual state of absolute indifference. She called the number Garrison had given her, voicemail. She left a message that said only, "I need to talk to you, not about the board, about the server access." And then she hung up and drank her coffee and thought about 11 months in Del Wick, which had been quiet and gray and manageable, and thought about what quiet and gray and manageable were worth, and arrived at no satisfying number. Garrison called back in 18 minutes. "Who was the 12th?" she said. A pause. Not a long one. The kind that means the question was expected. "Where are you right now?" "My apartment." "Alone?" "Yes." "Stay there. Patel and I are 20 minutes out." He hung up. She looked at the cactus. It looked back, or appeared to, in the way that inanimate objects appear to when you've been alone long enough. She thought about watering it and decided against it on the grounds that its entire success as a living organism was predicated on not being overwatered. And then she thought that she had a lot in common with that cactus. And then she stopped that line of thinking because it was heading somewhere self-pitying, and she didn't have time for self-pity right now. She checked her door locks. Both of them. She moved her go-bag from the closet shelf to the floor beside the bedroom door, which was where it had been for the first 3 months she'd lived here before she'd decided she was being paranoid and moved it to the closet. She checked what was in it. She always knew what was in it, but she checked anyway, because checking was precise and precision was something to hold on to. Then she sat on the couch and waited. Garrison and Patel arrived in 19 minutes, which meant they had already been closer than 20 when he called, which told her something. She let them in. Patel scanned the apartment without appearing to scan it, the practice sweep that looks like a casual glance and isn't. Garrison sat at the kitchen table. Sara sat across from him. Patel stayed near the window, which put her between the room and the street. "The 12th person with server access," Garrison said. "His name is Warren Stahl, former Defense Intelligence Agency, mid-tier analyst, separated 8 months ago under..." He paused in the way he had paused before, the way that covers something specific. A voluntary retirement that was not entirely voluntary. Sara turned the name over. "I don't know that name." "You wouldn't. He wasn't in the field. He was infrastructure, logistics routing, convoy scheduling, the kind of support role that sits behind the operation and never touches it directly." Garrison looked at her steadily. "But he was the analyst assigned to your unit's forward support function for 14 months, which means he had access to everything moving in and out of your area of operation, including Ramirez's route." "Including Ramirez's route," Sara put down her coffee cup, "and Tuesday's convoy." The routing request for Tuesday's convoy was processed through a legacy access credential that should have been deactivated when Stahl separated. It wasn't. That's an administrative failure, and there are several people inside the Pentagon who are currently having a very bad week because of it. Garrison's voice remained even. But the credential was used. 3 days before the attack, accessed from a server node in... He glanced at Patel. Meridian, Ohio, Patel said. Stahl has family in Meridian, Garrison continued. He's been there for 6 months. We have his location. What we don't have yet is who he's working with, because Stahl is not sophisticated enough to have built this network alone. He's a mid-tier analyst. He's a conduit. He paused. We believe he sold information to a private contractor with government connections who has been running a parallel intelligence for hire operation for at least 3 years. We don't have a name for the contractor. We have a structure, partial financials, 3 aliases that don't lead anywhere yet. Why are you telling me this? Sara said. It was the same question she had asked Whitmore, and she already knew it had a different answer. Because we need you to understand what you're in the middle of, Garrison said. Not peripheral to. In the middle of. This operation, whatever it is, whoever is running it, connected Ramirez's ambush and Tuesday's attack. Both of those operations involved your unit's classified deployment information. He looked at her directly. You're the only person from that unit who separated without being fully debriefed. The circumstances of your separation left a gap in the record. That gap was deliberate, she said. We know. Someone created it. We know that too. He leaned forward slightly. Sara, the gap in your record is the kind of gap that somebody created to make you look like you had something to hide. If this investigation ever becomes public, and it will eventually, that gap is the first thing that surfaces, and we need to close it before it does. She looked at the table. You want my full debrief. We want everything. What you knew when you separated, what you saw, what you were told to stay quiet about, and who told you. He waited. Whatever happened 4 years ago, whatever made you leave, we need to know it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street below, then another. The city was doing what cities do, indifferent to the conversation happening inside the apartment above it. If I give you that, Sara said, what happens to the people who pressured me to leave? Garrison and Patel exchanged a look that was brief and returned to neutral so quickly she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching. That depends on what you tell us, Garrison said. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. She picked up her coffee cup. It was empty. She set it back down. I need 24 hours. We'd rather... 24 hours, she said again. Not sharply, just finally. There are things I need to retrieve, physical records. I kept them. She looked at Garrison. I told you I'd talk to you. I will, but I do this right. Garrison studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. 24 hours. Don't go anywhere we can't find you. She looked at him steadily. You could already find me anywhere. The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been acknowledgement. They stood, gathered the folder, and Patel stopped near the door and said quietly, The man in the lobby this afternoon. We have him on camera. We're running the image. She paused. He's not one of ours. The door closed. Sara sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. She drove to a storage facility on the east side of Delwick at 7 the next morning. It was a small place, family-operated, the kind that charged reasonable monthly rates and kept decent lighting in the corridors, and did not ask many questions, which was what she had been looking for when she rented the unit 2 weeks after arriving in Delwick. Unit 47. Combination lock, not keyed, because keys could be taken and combinations existed only in one place. Inside the unit, a plastic storage bin, a waterproof duffel bag, and a firearm she was currently unlicensed to carry in the state, but which was legally owned and registered under her name in a state where she was still licensed, which existed in a legal gray area she had never fully resolved and was choosing not to resolve this morning. She opened the bin. The documents were in a sealed envelope inside a waterproof case inside the bin, which was the kind of redundancy that looked excessive until the moment it didn't. 4 years ago, when she had separated from the Army under circumstances that were framed as voluntary and weren't, she had made copies of everything she was not supposed to copy. This was, technically, a violation of several classified information protocols. She had made the copies anyway, at 3 in the morning in a base admin office in the 11-day window between being informed of her separation and the date it took effect, using a printer that she knew from prior experience was not networked to the monitoring system, because it was old, and IT had never gotten around to updating the connection. She had carried those copies in a sealed envelope for 4 years. She had moved them from Sutter Point to Delwick without opening them. Not because she had forgotten what was in them, but because opening them meant something she hadn't been ready to mean until now. She took the case back to her car and sat in the parking lot of the storage facility and opened it. The envelope was intact. She had sealed it with evidence tape and initialed the corners, the way she had been taught to secure field documentation. The initials were intact. No one had opened it. She opened it herself. The documents inside were what she remembered: routing records, communication logs, a series of internal memos with redacted sections that she had noted in the margins in pencil because pencil doesn't copy, and she had written down what the redacted sections contained from memory. Operational schedules, personnel assignments, and at the bottom, the thing she had kept because she had known, with the cold specific certainty of someone trained to recognize the difference between coincidence and pattern, that she would need it someday. A single printed email chain. 6 messages, 4 days of correspondence between 2 addresses she had cross-referenced at the time. One address was an official Army account that had since been deactivated. The other was a civilian account at a domain that appeared on its surface to be a private consulting firm. She had not known at the time who the civilian account belonged to. She looked at it now with the name Warren Stahl in her head and understood that she was close to knowing, but not there yet, because the email chain referenced a third party by initial only, a single letter, R, and R was the piece she was still missing. She photographed every document with her phone, sent the images to her own encrypted email, put the originals back in the envelope, sealed it with fresh tape, and went to meet Garrison. Well, the debrief took 4 hours. They did it at a field office space that Garrison's team had borrowed from the FBI resident agency in Delwick. A plain room with a plain table and a recorder and Patel taking notes by hand, in addition to the recording, which Sara appreciated because it meant someone was paying attention to the parts that didn't translate well to audio. She told them everything. She told them about the 14 months she had spent running trauma support for the forward unit, about the operational security practices that had seemed normal at the time and in retrospect had several anomalies she had cataloged but not reported because she had not had enough to report, and because the person she would have reported to was one of the anomalies. She told them about a week before Ramirez's ambush, when she had flagged an irregular routing change to a superior officer named Colonel Dennis Vrabel, who was now retired, she noted, and living in Scottsdale, and had been told the change was above her clearance level and to document nothing. She told them she had documented it anyway. She told them about her separation, which had been presented to her as a voluntary medical transition, but which had been preceded by 3 weeks of pressure, informal, deniable, the specific bureaucratic texture of institutional coercion. From 2 officers she named with dates and specifics that she read from memory with the kind of precision that made Garrison look up from his own folder twice. She told them about the email chain. She placed the photographed copies on the table, and Garrison and Patel went through them together in silence, and the silence had a particular quality. Not surprise, exactly, but the quality of pieces fitting into a space that had been waiting for them. Vrabel, Patel said. Not a question. Looking at the deactivated email address. The sending account was under his name when it was active, Sara said. I verified that against the base directory before I left. And R, Garrison said. I don't know who R is. We might. He looked at Patel. Something moved between them. A professional shorthand, the compressed communication of people who have worked together long enough to hold conversations with their eyes. Stahl, he said. Patel nodded. Stahl and Vrabel are the access and the routing. R is the client. The one running the network, Sara said. We think so. Then everything runs through finding R. Yes. Sara looked at the documents on the table. 12 years ago, she had been a surgical intern with a particular aptitude for working fast under pressure, and a recruiter who had noticed it and asked her a question she hadn't expected, and the answer she'd given had changed the subsequent decade of her life in ways she hadn't fully mapped when she gave it. She thought about that sometimes, the single moment of decision that restructures everything downstream without announcing what it's doing. She thought she might be in one of those moments again. What do you need from me now? She said. Garrison was quiet for a moment. For now, nothing more than what you've given us. This is significant. It gives us a formal documented connection between Vrabel and the civilian network, which is the link we've been missing. He gathered the photographs carefully. We need 48 hours to run this up the chain and coordinate the next steps. And in 48 hours, we'll have a better picture. He paused. In the meantime, I'd like to request that you stay available and that you be thoughtful about my security, she said. Your profile, he said carefully. The man in the lobby. We've ID'd the image. The name doesn't mean anything to us yet, but the pattern of movement in the footage is consistent with surveillance tradecraft. He looked at her steadily. You've been noticed, Sarah. That started before Tuesday, maybe long before Tuesday. What happened in the trauma bay accelerated it. She nodded slowly. Because I stopped being invisible. Because you were never actually invisible, he said. You were just quiet enough that whoever was watching was comfortable watching without acting. A pause. That may have changed. She drove home from the field office with that sitting on the passenger seat of her mind, which was not comfortable but was manageable, because most things were manageable if you didn't make the mistake of trying to manage all of them simultaneously. Marcus Holt called her at 4:15 that afternoon. She almost didn't answer. She looked at the number and thought about what he might want and answered because not answering was a decision too, and she preferred to make decisions with information. Malone. He still said her name like that. She noticed that it had bothered her less this time. Either she had recalibrated or he had, and she wasn't certain which. I owe you an explanation. She waited. The complaint. He was quiet for a moment. I filed it before I knew the full context. I understand that's not an excuse, then don't use it as one. A longer pause. Fair. Another pause. I also want to say... He stopped. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was working on something that didn't come easily. What you did Tuesday was... It was the right call, clinically. I've reviewed the procedure note 3 times. The modified approach was appropriate for the degree of tissue displacement. I wouldn't have gotten the tube in. You got it in. He said the last sentence with the flatness of a man stating a fact he finds difficult and has decided to state anyway. I've submitted an addendum to the complaint recommending it be withdrawn. She sat with that for a moment. Okay. That's it? Okay. What else do you want me to say? I don't know. He sounded genuinely uncertain, which was a quality she had not previously associated with him. I've been practicing for 12 years. I've been the best surgeon in every room I've been in for most of that. And you walked into that bay and did something I couldn't do, and you did it like it was... He stopped again. Like it was practice, she said. Yes, it was, once. She looked out the window. A long time ago. What happened? I left, she said simply, and then I tried to be something quieter for a while. He was quiet. Did it work? She thought about the storage unit and the 4-hour debrief and the man in the lobby with the controlled exit and the name R written in pencil in the margin of a document she had been carrying for 4 years. She thought about Okafor saluting before he knew why. Not really, she said. She ended the call. She was still looking out the window when her phone rang again, and the number was Garrison, and she answered it, and his voice was different from 4 hours ago. Compressed, clipped, the voice of someone who has received information that has changed the pace of things. We have a problem, he said. What kind? Stahl is gone. He left the Meridian address sometime in the last 6 hours. We had eyes on the location, but there was a gap in the rotation, and... He stopped, let out a controlled breath. He's in the wind, which means whoever he reports to knows we're closing in. Sarah stood up from the couch. That means they know about the debrief. It means they know something. We don't know the source of the leak. It could be Stahl's own surveillance of the federal system. It could be... He stopped again, and the stop said more than what followed it. It could be something closer to this investigation. She went cold. You have an internal problem. We may. We don't know. His voice was careful and precise, and she could hear the effort in it. What I know is that Stahl is moving, and if he's moving, the network is reacting, which means the timeline has accelerated. How accelerated? We need to assume that anyone connected to the investigation, anyone who's been visible, may be at elevated risk. He paused. Whitmore is still in the SICU. He's the only surviving witness of significant rank with direct knowledge of the original unit. Sarah had already moved to the bedroom. She was pulling the go bag off the floor. He needs additional security. We've contacted the hospital. They're increasing. That's not enough. She had the bag open. She was checking it the way she'd checked it 2 nights ago, fast and methodical. Marcus, what's the security setup at the SICU right now? Garrison caught himself. 2 uniformed from Whitmore's security detail, 1 Army MP outside the door, standard SICU nursing coverage. 3 people, she said. The hospital has 3 people, she repeated. Garrison, if this network is reacting to a federal investigation getting warm, they're not going to wait. Whatever they're going to do it while the window is still open. Before the debrief moves through the chain, before Vrabel's name lands somewhere with power attached to it, before R gets nervous enough to go dark permanently. She had the bag over her shoulder. The window is tonight. Silence on the line. Then Garrison said, "We can have, how long?" 45 minutes minimum. The tactical team is, "I'm 10 minutes from the hospital," she said. "Sarah, 10 minutes," she said. I'll call Okafor." She was already in the hall. Okafor picked up on the second ring and asked 0 unnecessary questions, which she filed away as one of his better qualities. She told him the situation in 90 seconds on the drive. He told her he was already at the hospital. He had been rotating through every few hours since Tuesday, which was either loyalty or instinct or both, and that he would meet her at the SYCU entrance. She ran 2 yellow lights and parked in the ambulance bay because it was closest, and she was done caring about parking violations. The SICU entrance was on the 3rd floor, secured access, and she had an active hospital badge that had not yet been deactivated despite the administrative leave, which was an administrative oversight she was currently grateful for. She badged through at 9:47 p.m. and moved down the corridor at a pace that was fast, without being the pace that makes people stop you. Okafor was at the junction of the main corridor and the SICU wing. He had changed into civilian clothes, but he was carrying himself the way he carried himself in uniform, which was the only uniform that actually mattered. "MP is still at the door," he said quietly, falling in beside her. "But Pruitt, Sergeant Pruitt from Tuesday, she went off rotation 20 minutes ago. I couldn't reach her to confirm she'd been replaced." "Who replaced her?" "I don't know. The detail lead didn't answer my call." Sarah processed that without slowing down. "Where are the 2 security detail from Tuesday? Carver's team?" "That's the other thing." His voice was level, but she could hear the specific tension in it, the controlled kind. "Carver was called out an hour ago. Some kind of coordination issue downtown. He took both of them." "He took both of them?" "Yes." She stopped walking. Okafor stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him and said, "Garrison thinks there's a leak inside the investigation." Okafor looked at her steadily. "Carver. I don't know. Maybe." She thought about the 11-minute conversation between Carver and Quarles, the way he had managed the room during the board meeting, the efficiency of his movement in and out of situations, or someone Carver trusts, or someone feeding information to someone Carver trusts. She was already moving again. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is Whitmore is in that room with 1 MP and possibly no security rotation, and Stahl is in the wind. They turned the corner into the SICU wing. The MP outside Whitmore's room was a young soldier, 22 at most, standing with the slightly rigid posture of someone who has been at a post long enough to be tired but is managing it. He saw Okafor and his posture changed. "Specialist." "Sergeant Morales?" Okafor said, reading the name tape. "When's the last time you checked in with the detail lead?" Morales hesitated. "About 40 minutes ago. I couldn't reach—" "How many other staff have been through this corridor in the last hour?" Another hesitation. "A maintenance crew came through around 9:15. Routine check on the HVAC." Sarah was already past him, hand on the door. She pushed it open. The room was dim. The monitors were running. Whitmore was in the bed, large frame motionless, the steady green line of his heart on the screen above him. The IV line running into his left arm had a secondary port. There was a syringe in the secondary port. The syringe was partially depressed, and the man standing at the bedside with his hand on the syringe turned at the sound of the door. He was not medical staff. She knew that in the same instant she knew everything else. Knew it from the angle of his shoulders and the way he was standing and the coat, the dark wool coat she had memorized from a lobby reflection. And the syringe was half empty and the monitor above the bed had not yet changed but would, in approximately 60 seconds, if whatever was in that syringe reached full circulation. The man let go of the syringe. His other hand moved toward his jacket. Sara crossed the room. Sara crossed the room. Not fast enough to look reckless, fast enough to matter. The distance was 12 feet, and she covered it in the time it took the man's hand to clear his jacket lapel, and she hit his forearm with the flat of her palm before the hand completed whatever it was reaching for, which turned out to be a secondary device rather than a weapon, a small black cylinder about the size of a marker that clattered off the IV pole and skittered across the floor tile. He was bigger than her. Most people were bigger than her. She had long ago stopped treating that as a relevant variable. She got her left hand on the syringe and pulled it clear of the port in one motion. Critical, pull it out before it fully empresses, before whatever's in there finishes its path. And her right hand went to the man's collar and she used his own momentum, which had been forward, toward her, and redirected it sideways into the equipment cart against the wall. The cart went over. The man went into the wall. He didn't go down. He turned faster than she'd estimated, which recalibrated her assessment of him upward, and his elbow caught her in the left shoulder, hard enough to send a white flare up through her neck, and she backed 2 steps and put the IV pole between them and held the syringe behind her back. "Okafor," she said, not loud. The door had already opened. Okafor came in low, moving correctly, and the MP Morales was behind him with his hand on his sidearm, and the man in the wool coat looked at the geometry of the room and did the calculation that anyone with training does when the geometry turns against you, which is to stop. He stopped. His hands went out to his sides. "Floor," Okafor said, a long second. Then the man went to his knees and then to the floor, and Morales had the cuffs on him before his chest finished lowering, which was the first thing Morales had done in the last 20 minutes that Sara was fully satisfied with. She turned to the monitor. Whitmore's heart line was still green, still regular, still the steady sinus rhythm of a recovering man who had not yet received whatever was in the syringe in her hand. She exhaled through her nose. Her shoulder was already stiffening. She rotated it once, felt the grinding complaint of muscles that had been hit hard, and moved to the head of the bed. "General?" She put 2 fingers on his wrist, pulse strong, respirations normal. "General Whitmore." His eyes opened. He had been asleep, heavily, the medicated sleep of post-surgical recovery. And he surfaced slowly, the way people surface when the sleep has been real and the waking is unwanted. "What?" he said. His voice was rough. "You're okay. Stay still." He looked at the man on the floor, at Morales kneeling on his back, at the overturned equipment cart, at Sara standing at his bedside with something in her right hand and her left shoulder at a slightly wrong angle. He said nothing for a moment, then, again. "Yes," she said. "Are you injured?" "No," which was approximately true, and that the shoulder would resolve and nothing was broken, and this did not meet any standard she applied to the word injured. She looked at the syringe in her hand. Clear fluid. No label. She set it on the bedside table without touching the plunger and took out her phone and photographed it against the white surface, and then texted the photograph to Garrison with a single accompanying line. "SICU. Whitmore. Attempted. I have the agent. Send forensics." Garrison's response was 11 seconds. En route. "Do not move him. Keep the room sealed." She put the phone away. Okafor was standing over the man on the floor, with the specific stillness of someone using effort not to do something he wanted to do. The man on the floor was saying nothing. He had the flat, closed expression of someone who has run the math on talking and decided against it. Sara crouched beside him. He was 40s, unremarkable features, the kind of face that was genuinely difficult to reconstruct from memory. Not distinctive, not forgettable enough to be notable for its forgettability. A professional face, in the same way a professional tool has no unnecessary features. "The black cylinder," she said. "What was it?" He looked at the wall. "A jammer," Okafor said from behind her. He had retrieved it from the floor without her noticing, holding it by the edges. "Medical device frequency jammer. It would have knocked the monitors offline at the point of the—" He stopped. It would have looked like equipment failure. Sara stood up. A jammer for the monitors, a syringe with no label in a secondary port, and a security rotation that had been pulled out of the building by a coordination issue that had materialized exactly when it was needed. She thought about all three of those things together and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when something you suspected becomes something you know. "Lock the room," she said to Morales. "Nobody in or out without Garrison's authorization." "Yes, ma'am." She went into the corridor. Garrison arrived with Patel and 2 federal agents and a forensics technician at 10:23. They moved fast and quietly, and the SICU staff on the overnight shift watched from the nursing station with the expressions of people who had thought their night was going to be routine and were now revising that assessment significantly. The forensics tech took the syringe. He would not tell her what was in it until the lab confirmed, but she described what she had observed, the rate of depression, the estimated volume delivered before she pulled it. And he made notes and said it would be a few hours and looked at her with the slightly dazed expression of someone processing the narrowness of the margin they were working with. Garrison pulled her into the family consultation room off the main corridor. "The man on the floor," he said. "Surveillance. I saw him in the lobby 2 days ago. He made a controlled exit. He had hospital maintenance credentials, issued 6 hours ago through the facilities management system." Garrison sat down and then appeared to reconsider sitting down and stood back up. "The credentials were generated using an administrator login that belongs to an assistant facilities manager named Terrence Holt." Sara stopped. "Holt," she said. Garrison looked at her steadily. "Related to Dr. Marcus Holt, his younger brother. Terrence Holt has worked in hospital facilities management for 6 years. He has no prior record, no flagged associations, nothing. He's clean on paper." A pause. "He's also not answering his phone and is not at his home address." Sara thought about Marcus calling her that afternoon, the slightly undone quality of the conversation, the difficulty he'd had saying what he'd said. She thought about whether that difficulty was genuine. She said, "Do you think Marcus knew?" "I don't know yet. I need to know." "So do I." He looked at her. "What's your read?" She thought about 12 years of reading people in high-pressure situations, which was the only reliable laboratory for the skill. She thought about Marcus in the trauma bay, genuinely frozen, genuinely frightened, the kind of fear that doesn't perform well. She thought about his voice on the phone that afternoon, the specific sound of a man doing something uncomfortable voluntarily, which was different from the sound of a man managing a performance. "I think he didn't know," she said. "I think he's going to find out in about 6 hours, and it's going to be one of the worst moments of his life." Garrison nodded slowly. "We still have to talk to him." "I know. Tonight." "I know." She paused. "Let me be there." "Sara, not in the room, but let me be there." She looked at him steadily. "If his brother is involved and he doesn't know, he's going to need someone in that building who he has a working relationship with. Even a bad one." She paused. "Right now, that's me." Garrison considered it for a moment. "Hallway. You stay in the hallway." "Hallway," she agreed. They found Marcus at the hospital. He was still in the building at 10:45 p.m. because he had been in surgery since 7, a 4-hour cardiac case that had run long. And he was in the surgeon's lounge in his scrubs with coffee. He wasn't drinking when Garrison and Patel walked in. Sara was in the hallway. She couldn't hear the words through the door, but she heard the rhythm of it. Garrison's measured cadence, then Marcus's voice, which started at the register of someone answering routine questions and changed, within about 4 minutes, into something that had no register she had a clean word for. Not grief exactly. Not shock. The sound of something structural giving way, which is quieter than people expect, and worse. The door opened 8 minutes later. Marcus came out first. He was still in his scrubs. He was a large man, and right now he looked reduced in some way that had nothing to do with his size. He saw Sara in the hallway and stopped. She looked at him. He said, "Did you know?" "Not about your brother, no." "But you knew something?" "I knew the security was compromised. I didn't know the vector." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry, Marcus." He looked at the wall. His jaw was working. He was, she understood, doing what she had watched him do in the trauma bay, suppressing the visible signal of an internal state, because that was what he knew how to do, and right now it was the only tool available to him. Terrence doesn't... He's not... He stopped. He's not a bad person. He's not... I know. She didn't fully, but she understood what he was trying to say. He got into something he couldn't get out of, Marcus said. That's what it is. That's what happened. He said it with the specific insistence of someone constructing a frame fast, because the alternative frames were unbearable, and the insistence was all that was holding the bearable one in place. She didn't argue with it. They're going to find him, she said. And when they do, you should have a lawyer. He looked at her. For yourself, she said, precautionary. The investigation is going to run wide. You want counsel on record early. She paused. I can ask Garrison for a referral if you don't have one. He stared at her for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating something, the category he'd had for her, the position he'd assigned to her in his hierarchy of this department, the 12 months of dismissal and the complaint and the Tuesday he'd been unable to get the tube in, and she had. All of it running through some internal reprocessing that was moving fast because it had to. Why are you helping me? He said. Because you called me this afternoon and said a hard thing when you didn't have to, she said. That matters. She pushed off the wall and went back toward the SICU, and behind her she heard him stand in the hallway in his scrubs and say nothing for a long time, which was probably the right response. Terrence Holt was apprehended at 4:17 a.m. at a bus terminal in Weston, 40 miles south of Delwick. He had a bag, a burner phone, and the beginning of a very poor plan that had not accounted for the facial recognition sweep that Garrison's team had put on every transit hub within a 50-mile radius at 11 p.m. He was 28 years old, and when they brought him in, he looked it. Not the professional blankness of the man in Whitmore's room, but something frightened and young and already beginning to understand the dimensions of what he had gotten himself into. He talked inside of 3 hours. Patel called Sara at 7:45 a.m. and said, he was recruited 14 months ago. Someone came to him with hospital access requests, small things initially, administrative details, scheduling information. He was paid well and told it was corporate intelligence, competitor analysis, medical procurement research. She paused. He didn't know what it was actually for until about 6 months ago. By then he was in deep enough that the people he was working with made the alternative clear. What's the alternative? Sara said, though she already knew. They told him what they were and what they could do. To him and to Marcus. A pause. He's been feeding them access ever since. Who's his contact? A man he knows only as Reston. No last name, no face. All communication was encrypted text. He has an address he used for 2 in-person meetings. Commercial property in the Delwick warehouse district. Patel's voice was careful. Garrison is moving on it this morning. Sara looked out her apartment window. The city was doing the early morning thing. Delivery trucks, the first commuters, the particular gray light of a day that hadn't committed yet to what it was going to be. Reston, she said. We think the R in the email chain, Patel said. We can't confirm until we have someone in custody who can confirm, but the operational profile matches. Private intelligence broker. Government-adjacent contracting. Long-term network with DoD access running back. Possibly as far as the Ramirez ambush. The person who Vrabel was selling to. Yes. Sara sat down. 14 months, she said. He's been operating in this city for 14 months. At least. She thought about that. About 11 months of her own life in this city, quiet and gray and managed, and about the storage unit on the east side and the sealed envelope and the go bag on the floor beside the bed, and about the man in the lobby with the controlled exit, and realized that the surveillance of her had likely begun before she was consciously aware of being watched, that the quiet she had built around herself had been observed, catalogued, and factored into someone else's operational calculation, that her invisibility had not been anonymity, it had been monitoring. Patel, she said. Yes. How long have they known where I was? A pause that told her the answer before Patel said it. We think since Sutter Point, possibly longer. She looked at the cactus on the sill. Okay, she said. Are you... Okay, she said again. Call me when Garrison has the warehouse. The warehouse raid was at 9 a.m. She was not part of it. She was in her apartment, which she had agreed to stay in at Garrison's direct and firm request, and she sat on her couch with her phone and monitored the updates that Okafor, who was also not part of it, but who had positioned himself in a parking structure with a line of sight to the building and was texting her real-time observations with the efficiency of someone who had learned surveillance from people who were serious about it, relayed to her in terse, accurate fragments. Team staged outside. 6 agents plus 2 tactical. Entry at 09:03. Clearing now. 2 individuals inside. A pause that lasted 4 minutes and was the longest 4 minutes Sara had spent on a couch in recent memory. 1 detained. 1 fled through secondary exit. They're in pursuit. She stood up. Detained individual is a man, 50s, matching the Reston description. The other... Another pause. The other is Vrabel. She exhaled. Dennis Vrabel. The man she had reported to 14 months before Ramirez's ambush. The man who had told her the routing change was above her clearance level and to document nothing. The man who had retired to Scottsdale and whom she had thought was removed from this by distance and time and the comfortable buffer of a voluntary exit. He had not been removed. He had been running. Vrabel in custody. Reston still being pursued. Garrison says stay put. She sat back down. The pursuit took 22 minutes. Reston, whose full name turned out to be Edward Reston, 53, former CIA contractor, with a 14-year career that had ended in 2019 under circumstances that were classified but that Garrison would later describe to Sara as a pattern of unauthorized intelligence monetization, was apprehended in a rail yard 2 miles from the warehouse after a pursuit that involved 3 federal agents, 1 Delwick police unit that had been radioed in as backup, and a chain-link fence that Reston was not as young as he needed to be to clear cleanly. He was in federal custody by 9:31 a.m. Garrison called her at 9:34. Reston and Vrabel, and he said, "We have both. The warehouse had documentation, physical and digital, servers on site. We're pulling everything." His voice had the quality of a man who has just finished something that has taken a long time and finds himself slightly uncertain what to do with the transition. The syringe from Whitmore's room came back from the lab, potassium chloride in a concentration that would have simulated cardiac arrest. A pause. He would have been dead within 4 minutes, and the cause would have looked natural on initial examination. She sat with that. "Sara." His voice changed slightly. "I need you to come in. Full evidentiary debrief. Your documents, your account, the storage unit. We need to bring all of it formally into the record." "When?" "This afternoon, if you can." "I can," she said. She put the phone down and looked at the cactus again and thought that she should probably water it today, as a departure from routine, and then she went to get ready. The formal debrief took 7 hours and was conducted at a federal facility that was larger than the borrowed FBI space and had a more significant coffee machine, which she appreciated because she had been awake for most of the past 30 hours, and the coffee was doing the work that sleep would have done under other circumstances. She gave them everything. The documents from the storage unit, originals, not just the photographs, which she retrieved and transported under Patel's escort. The complete account of her separation, including the names, dates, and precise language of the pressure she had received, which she recited from memory in an order that impressed even Patel, who she was beginning to understand was not easily impressed. She gave them Vrabel's name, the conversation she had documented in pencil in the margins, the routing anomaly she had flagged and been told to forget. She gave them the 4 years of context that had never been formally recorded because the mechanism for recording it had been the same mechanism that had pressured her out. She was thorough because thoroughness was what the moment required, and because she had been carrying these documents for 4 years, and the weight of carrying them had been the particular weight of things that are kept rather than released, which is heavier than it looks. Near the end of the 7th hour, Garrison put down his pen and said, "For the record, the circumstances of your separation. The record that exists attributes it to a voluntary medical transition. We're going to correct that record." She looked at him. "The Army will issue a formal correction," he said. "It requires some process, a review board, paperwork that takes weeks. But the outcome is not in question. The documentation you've provided, combined with what we've pulled from the warehouse servers, establishes clearly that your separation was coerced." He paused. Colonel Avery has already been briefed. She's prepared to facilitate. Sarah thought about the moment she had handed in her credentials. The small office, the forms, the person across the desk from her who had not looked her in the eye. The version of events she had told herself for 4 years, which was that she had made a choice, and the version she had also told herself underneath that, which was that the choice had been made for her, and she had chosen to call it a choice because calling it what it was would have required fighting something she had not had the strength to fight. Not then. That would be... She stopped, started again. Yes, I'd want that. You'll have it. Garrison closed his folder. For what it's worth, you did good work tonight, under circumstances that were... He seemed to be searching for accurate language. Considerably outside what we should have asked of you. You didn't ask, she said. No. He looked at her. You just did it. She gathered her jacket from the back of the chair and stood up and thought that she should probably call Okafor, who had been texting her at intervals throughout the day with information and once with a photograph of bad cafeteria food and the single word tragic, which she had appreciated in the way that she appreciated small things that were exactly what they were. She was in the corridor when Patel stopped her. One more thing, Patel said. The man from Whitmore's room, the one you stopped. She held a tablet out to Sarah. He talked. He said Reston had a contingency plan in the event of operational compromise. A pause. The contingency wasn't about Whitmore. Sarah looked at the tablet. The contingency was detailed in a single page of extracted warehouse documentation. It was clinical and precise and had the functional quality of something written by someone who had planned contingencies long enough to have developed a template. She read it twice. The contingency was not a person. It was a sequence of events, a series of actions to be taken in the event that the network was compromised and key operatives were at risk of arrest. Actions designed to destroy evidence, discredit witnesses, and in a section labeled with a term she recognized from intelligence tradecraft as meaning permanent source elimination, neutralize the individuals whose testimony could most damage the network in federal proceedings. 3 names were on that list. Whitmore was first. Vrabel was second, which was why he had been in the warehouse, she understood, not running the operation but being managed, kept close, kept controlled. The third name was hers. She looked at it for a moment. Her own name, in a document retrieved from a warehouse in Delwick, in a contingency plan written by a man who had been monitoring her for longer than she'd been in this city, planning what to do with her if the structure he'd built started collapsing around her. The contingency is no longer actionable, Patel said carefully. Reston and Vrabel are in custody. The man from the hospital is in custody. The network has been substantially disrupted. Another pause. Substantially, not completely. Sarah handed the tablet back. Who else? She said. Patel looked at her steadily. The warehouse servers are still being processed. Garrison thinks 48 to 72 hours before we have a full picture of the network's active members. She paused. What we know right now is that Reston had one additional contractor who was not in the warehouse, who was not in Delwick. A pause. Who may not know yet that Reston is in custody. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and was answered. And if that contractor doesn't know yet, Sarah said, then they're still operating under the contingency plan, Patel said, which means the plan is still active. She looked at Sarah directly. Which means the list is still active. Sarah stood in the corridor of a federal facility in Delwick at 11:45 p.m. with her jacket over her arm and 30 hours without sleep behind her, and her name on a list in a contingency plan written by a man who is now in federal custody. She thought about Okafor's photograph of the bad cafeteria food. She thought about the cactus on the windowsill. She thought about the go bag beside the bedroom door, which she had not unpacked. Then she thought about the one name that had threaded through this entire architecture, through the warehouse documentation, through Terrence Holt's account, through the encrypted communications Garrison's team was processing, and that she had not yet heard confirmed aloud, and that she had been circling for 4 days without landing. She looked at Patel. The contractor, she said. The one who's still in the field. Patel's expression told her, before the words did, that the answer was going to be the particular kind of bad that required sitting down to receive properly. His operational name in the Reston network documents, Patel said, is listed as Carver. Patel's expression told her, before the words did, that the answer was going to be the particular kind of bad that required sitting down to receive properly. His operational name in the Reston Network documents is listed as Carver. Sara didn't sit down. She stood in the corridor and let the information settle through her the way cold water settles, not absorbed all at once, but moving through layer by layer until it reached the bottom. Carver, the man in the suit who had managed Whitmore's security detail from the moment the general arrived at Halcyon General. The man who had pulled both security agents out of the hospital on the night someone tried to kill Whitmore with a syringe and a secondary IV port. The man who had been in the board meeting and the conference room and the hallway outside Whitmore's SICU room, positioned close to the investigation, close to the evidence, close to every conversation that mattered. Not managing the situation, running it. "Where is he now?" she said. "Unknown," Patel said. "He checked out of the hotel the DOD had him in at approximately 9 p.m. last night. That's 2 hours after the arrest in Whitmore's room." She paused, which means he knew within 2 hours. "He has contacts inside the federal response," Sara said. "We have to assume so." "Yes." "Then he knows about Reston and Vrabel." "By now, almost certainly." Sara thought about what a man like Carver did when his network collapsed. Not a field operative. He was too managed for that, too embedded in the institutional layer. He was a coordinator, a broker, the kind of person whose value was his access, and whose access was now burned. Which meant he had two options: run or execute whatever remained of the contingency before the window closed completely. "The list," she said. "Yes," Patel said. "Whitmore is in the SICU with a full federal security rotation now." "Yes." "Vrabel is in custody." "Yes." That left one name, and they were both standing in a corridor with that name between them. And Sara understood the conversation they were having underneath the words they were saying, which was about whether she was going to go back to her apartment and wait, or whether she was going to do something with the 30 hours of fatigue and the knowledge she was currently carrying. "I need a phone," she said. "Mine may be compromised if he had access to the investigation's communications." Patel handed her a spare without being asked, which confirmed that Patel had been thinking about this longer than the conversation had been running. Sara dialed Okafor. He picked up in 2 rings. "I heard," he said, which meant his network inside the military detail had been faster than the federal briefing chain, which did not surprise her. "Where are you?" 2 blocks from your building," he said. "I've been here for the last hour." She thought about the particular quality of Okafor, the way he showed up without being told to, without requiring instruction, without needing the situation explained to him before he positioned himself correctly. She thought about the fact that he had done this repeatedly over the past 4 days, and that she had not adequately accounted for it. "Stay visible," she said. "Don't go inside." "I'm not the one he's looking for." "I know, but you're associated. Stay visible and stay mobile, and if anything moves near that building, you call me on this number." "Copy." She ended the call and looked at Patel. "I need to go back to my apartment." "Sara, if Carver is executing the contingency, he knows the federal facility is too hard a target. He knows Whitmore has protection. He knows Vrabel is already in a cell." She kept her voice level. "The only accessible name on that list is mine, and the only accessible location is my apartment, because that's where I live and that's in the record, and he's had months to know it." She paused. "So we either wait here and hope he surfaces somewhere else, or we use what we know and control the environment." Patel studied her for a long moment with the expression of someone weighing a decision that has significant personal and professional consequences in both directions. "You're not doing this alone," Patel said. "I know. Garrison needs to know." "Then call him while I put my jacket on." Garrison was predictably not pleased. He was also, after 6 minutes of a conversation that Sara was not present for, but could partially reconstruct from Patel's side of it, persuaded. Not because the plan was without risk, it wasn't, and he said so multiple times in the 6 minutes, but because the alternative was waiting, and waiting with an active contractor who had inside knowledge of federal communications, and a contingency that was still technically operable was its own category of risk, one that was harder to control because it was passive. He sent 4 agents ahead to establish positions around the apartment building. He sent Okafor, with some reluctance, expressed to Sara as, "He's not federal. He can't be armed in an official capacity in this situation." And Sara's response, "He won't need to be. He's early warning." Garrison had looked at her and let it go. Sara arrived at her building at 12:40 a.m. The city was quieter now, but not quiet. Delwick didn't fully sleep, just changed its rhythm, and the block her building was on had the low-grade ambient life of a street that was never completely dark. She went in through the front entrance with her badge and took the stairs rather than the elevator, not because the elevator was dangerous, but because stairs gave her the option of stopping on any landing and changing direction, which the elevator did not. Her apartment was on the 4th floor. She reached the 3rd floor landing and paused. The stairwell above her was not empty. She didn't hear anything specific. It was more of a pressure difference, the particular quality of a contained space that has someone in it versus a contained space that doesn't, which is a distinction that sounds abstract until you have spent enough time moving through spaces where the distinction mattered very much. She pressed her back against the stairwell wall and sent a single text to the number Patel had given for the lead agent outside, 4th floor stairwell. Not clear. 3 seconds. Then footsteps above her. Not trying to be quiet. Moving with the confidence of someone who had planned for this and was executing, which was in some ways more alarming than stealth would have been. Because confidence in a situation like this meant the person had calculated that they had enough time and enough advantage not to need stealth. She went up anyway, not because it was the strategically ideal choice, because the stairwell above her was between her and the only exit that the federal agents weren't currently covering, and because whoever was above her knew the building layout, and because the fundamental truth of the situation was that she had been waiting for something to move toward her for 4 years, and it was moving, and she was done with the waiting. Carver was on the 4th floor landing. He was exactly as she remembered him. The suit, the management posture, the face that had operated in professional proximity to serious people for long enough to have absorbed their surface without absorbing what was underneath it. He had a phone in his left hand, which was either for communications or a secondary device, and his right hand was at his side, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been running a calculation and had just confirmed a variable. "You should have stayed in the federal building," he said. His voice was the same voice he had used in the conference room in the hospital corridor. Measured, organized. The voice of someone who considered themselves a manager of situations rather than a participant in them, and who had operated that way for long enough to have forgotten that situations don't always consent to being managed. "You pulled Whitmore's detail," she said. She kept her distance, 10 feet, landing between them, her back not to the wall but angled so the wall was available if she needed it. "Operational logistics," he said. "There was a genuine coordination issue. I leveraged it." He paused. "The man I sent was good. He's in federal custody. I know." Something moved in his face, not quite regret, more the functional acknowledgement of a resource that has been expended and cannot be recovered. Reston's network is thorough in some areas and careless in others. The hospital access was careless. I told him that. But you still used it. The timeline moved faster than we anticipated. He looked at her directly. You were faster than we anticipated. We had assessed you as contained, adapted, settled into civilian life in a way that would keep you manageable. She thought about 11 months of double shifts and bad coffee and the cactus on the windowsill. That worked for a while, she said, until the general's convoy. He tilted his head slightly. We underestimated the probability that Whitmore would recognize you. That was a failure in the original assessment. He paused. My failure, not Reston's. You were the one who managed the initial unit assessment, she said. It wasn't a question. The pieces had been assembling themselves since Patel said his name, and now she was just confirming the shape. I was DoD adjacent for 6 years before I moved to private contracting, he said. Your unit fell within my oversight area for 14 months. I was thorough. Thorough enough to know about Ramirez's route. His expression didn't change. Ramirez's ambush was Reston's operation. I provided the access architecture. I didn't design the action. That's a very specific distinction, she said. It's a legally meaningful one, he said, and something in the way he said it told her that he had been running that distinction through his head for a long time, sharpening it, preparing it for a room with lawyers in it, and that the preparation was a sign that he had considered the possibility of this conversation, but had calculated it would happen differently, in a location he controlled, at a time of his choosing, with a different outcome. She looked at the phone in his left hand. "You're recording this," she said. "I was hoping for something more usable," he said. "An admission, a threat. Something that could complicate the federal case if this conversation needed to be introduced." He looked at the phone, then at her. "You haven't given me anything." "I know," she said. "You knew I'd be recording." "I assumed." He was quiet for a moment. The stairwell was very still. Somewhere below them a door opened and closed, the sound traveling up the shaft in the way sounds traveled in this building, clearly with a slight echo. "What happens now?" he said, and for the first time his voice had a quality that was not entirely managed. Not fear. He was too professional for what she would have called fear. But the recognition of a man who has been good at controlling outcomes for a very long time and is now standing in a stairwell at 12:45 in the morning with the specific sensation of an outcome he cannot control. "Now," Sara said, "you put the phone down and walk down the stairs." He looked at the stairwell door behind her. "There are 4 federal agents at the building exits," she said, "and Garrison is 3 minutes out, and Okafor is on the street." The phone came up. Not toward her, but she had already moved, the half-step left that changed the angle because the phone was not a phone. In that moment, it was whatever it was, and she got her hand on his wrist before the hand finished rising and bent it back with the specific mechanical efficiency of a technique that is not about strength and does not need to be. And the phone, which was, in the end, just a phone, no secondary device, she had been wrong about that and noted it, hit the landing floor and cracked. Carver's knees hit the landing 2 seconds later, not because she had done something dramatic, because she had put pressure on a joint at the correct angle and the joint had communicated clearly to the rest of him what the options were. And he was under everything else, a man who had spent his career in coordination roles and not in rooms where physical resistance was ever a meaningful option. She held the position. His breathing was controlled. She gave him credit for that. The stairwell door below opened and 2 federal agents came through it moving fast. And the scene they arrived at was a man in a suit on his knees on a landing and Sara Malone standing over him with one hand on his wrist, not breathing hard, the phone in pieces on the concrete floor beside them. The agents took him. She let go. She stood back against the wall and watched them walk him down the stairs and thought that she would very much like to sit down somewhere that was not a stairwell, possibly soon. Garrison arrived at 12:51 and looked at the cracked phone and at Sara and said, "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her shoulder, which she had apparently been favoring without fully noticing. "Your shoulder. It's old, from last night." She straightened it. "I'm fine." He nodded slowly. "We have him." "I know. All 3 of them, Reston, Vrabel, Carver. The warehouse servers have given us 2 additional network members so far, both in federal facilities in other states. By the end of the week, we expect to have the full picture." He paused. "It's over, Sara." She looked at the cracked phone on the landing. "Almost," she said. The things that happen after are not dramatic. This is the part that stories rarely tell accurately, the aftermath, which is not a resolution so much as a long, unglamorous process of dismantling what was built wrong and rebuilding what was broken, one administrative step at a time. Sara had done enough institutional work to know that the undoing of damage is slower and less satisfying than the doing of it, and she had prepared herself for that, because preparation was what she had, instead of the comfortable expectation that things would resolve cleanly. Reston, Vrabel, and Carver were formally charged within 72 hours of their arrests. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, espionage-adjacent violations under federal statute, attempted murder in the case of the syringe in Whitmore's room, and a series of financial crimes that the forensic accountants were still working through when the initial arraignment happened. All 3 were denied bail on the grounds that they represented a flight risk of the most unambiguous variety. The man from Whitmore's room, whose name was Felix Odom, which sounded unremarkable and was, in every external way, an unremarkable name for an unremarkable-looking man who had been doing remarkable violence on behalf of people who preferred not to do it themselves, was charged separately and pleaded out within 3 weeks. His cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, giving the prosecutors enough to fill several gaps in the network's financial structure that the warehouse servers alone hadn't covered. Terrence Holt was charged with facilitation of unauthorized access and conspiracy, which were serious charges that carried real consequences. He was 28 and frightened and had, as Marcus had said, gotten into something he couldn't get out of. The law did not consider that a defense, and it wasn't exactly. It was a partial explanation of how ordinary people end up inside extraordinary situations and make choices they would not make in the light of full understanding. His attorney negotiated. The prosecution had enough from his cooperation that they were willing to negotiate. The outcome was not nothing, and it was not everything, and it was, in the way that most legal outcomes are, a settlement with reality. Marcus found out through official channels before Sara had a chance to speak to him directly. She ran into him in the Halcyon General parking structure 4 days after the arrests, both of them arriving at the same hour for shifts that Sara was technically not supposed to be on yet, but had come in for anyway because staying in her apartment had reached the limits of what she was able to do with it. He looked like someone who had slept badly for 4 days, which was accurate. "How is he?" she said. "Scared," Marcus said. He's 28. He's scared." He stood with his keys in his hand and looked at the concrete pillar beside him instead of at her. "I keep thinking about what I would have done if someone had come to me that way, with that kind of leverage." He stopped. "I don't know what I would have done." "Yes, you do," Sara said. He looked at her. "You filed a complaint against me when you thought I'd overstepped," she said. "You went through the institutional process even when you were angry. That's who you are." She paused. "Terrence didn't have your instinct for the institution. They found the gap in him and they used it." Another pause. "That's not nothing, but it's also not you." He was quiet for a long moment. "I withdrew the complaint," he said, formally, with a written statement to the board. He paused. "I said you demonstrated superior clinical judgment and that my initial assessment was incorrect." "I know. Garrison showed me the board's record." "I should have said it louder," he said. "I should have said it in a room with more people in it." She looked at him. He was not a different person than he had been 11 months ago. He was the same person, with the same instincts and the same ego and the same capacity for both dismissal and the difficult, necessary reversal of dismissal. People didn't transform. They revealed slowly which of their capacities they were willing to use. "You're saying it now," she said. He nodded once and went inside. The Army Review Board convened 3 weeks after the arrests. Colonel Avery ran it, which Sara had been told in advance and which she was quietly grateful for, because Avery had the particular quality of someone who understood that procedural correctness was not the same thing as institutional fairness and was committed to both. The board reviewed the documentation Sara had provided, the warehouse server evidence, the DCIS investigation findings, and the formal accounts of 3 officers who had been present during the period of her coerced separation and who, now that the network was dismantled and the institutional protection that had kept them silent was gone, were willing to provide what they should have provided 4 years ago. The review took 2 days. The outcome was unambiguous. Coerced separation, formal correction of record, restoration of rank, back pay for the period of incorrect separation, a number that was significant and that she was going to have to figure out what to do with, which was a problem she had not previously had and which she was prepared to treat as a good problem. A formal letter of commendation, co-signed by Whitmore from his recovery room at Halcyon General, citing her actions over the preceding weeks with the specific, documented language of institutional recognition. She sat in the review board room and received the outcome and said thank you in the way she said most things, without performance, without the visible release of 4 years of carried weight, because the release was happening, but it was internal and quiet and not something she needed anyone else to see. Avery walked her out. "What do you want to do?" Avery said. "Not what are you going to do? What do you want?" The distinction was deliberate. "I don't know yet," Sara said. "I've been thinking about that." "Take time." "I'm not good at taking time." Avery smiled, which was a rarer expression on her face than it might have been on someone else's, and was therefore more meaningful when it appeared. "No," she said. "You're not. I could tell that from the file." She paused. There are options. If you want to come back, there are roles. Training, primarily. We have a deficit in forward trauma instruction that someone with your background would address very directly. She paused again. But that's not a recruitment pitch. That's just information. I'll think about it, Sara said. That's all I asked. Whitmore was discharged from Halcyon General on a Thursday morning, 31 days after the convoy attack. He walked out under his own power, which the surgical team had rated as ambitious and which he had rated as the only acceptable option. He moved slowly and with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told what was holding him together and was taking that information seriously, but he walked. Sara was in the lobby. She had not planned to be. She had come to the hospital for a meeting with Quarles about her return to the department, a meeting that was itself the product of a board decision that had been significantly influenced by the joint letter from the DOD and the DCIS and Whitmore's formal commendation, and that Quarles had conducted with the carefully neutralized expression of someone who understood that the institutional landscape had changed and was adapting accordingly. The meeting had run long, and she was in the lobby because she had come down for coffee, and Whitmore was in the lobby because that was where discharge happened. He saw her. He came to her. He was slower than he had been, and he would be slower for a while yet, and he carried the particular posture of a man who has recalibrated his relationship with his own body and found the recalibration uncomfortable but acceptable. He stood in front of her with his security detail, new detail, fully vetted, a process that Garrison's team had overseen personally, at a respectful distance. Captain Malone, he said. She looked at him. The formal title said here, in the lobby of the hospital where she had spent 11 months being invisible. General, she said. I wanted to say it in person. He paused. In a building with witnesses. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to. He looked at her steadily with the eyes that had found her across a trauma bay in the middle of a surge and recognized her before anyone else did, which was, she thought, something that she would carry in a different way than she had been carrying things. You saved my life twice, he said. The first time in that bay with 12 people watching. The second time in a hospital room in the middle of the night with 2 witnesses and no audience. He paused. I'm aware that the second one was considerably more difficult. The first one was harder, actually, she said. The second one I just had to get there fast enough. Something shifted in his expression, not quite humor, something adjacent to it. The thing that appears in people who have been through enough that the distance between difficult and absurd has compressed to almost nothing. The Army letter, he said. The commendation. I wrote it myself. The staff offered to draft it. He paused. I wrote it myself. I read it, she said. Thank you. He put his hand out. She shook it. It was not a ceremony. It was a handshake between 2 people who had worked together under conditions that neither of them would have designed but both had navigated, and who were parting in a direction that was forward rather than back. His grip was solid and recovering, the particular grip of a man who has been told not to strain himself and is applying that instruction selectively. He walked out through the automatic doors. The lobby went back to being the lobby. She took the job, not immediately. She took 3 weeks first, which for her was the equivalent of what other people called months, and she spent them doing the things that her life in Delwick had not had room for. She drove to the coast, which was 4 hours, and stood on a beach that was cold and gray and almost empty, and stayed there for an afternoon doing nothing, which was harder than it sounds, and which she got better at as the hours passed. She called a woman named Diane Kowalski, who had been her closest friend during her first deployment, and who had spent the past 4 years not asking questions because Sara had not invited them, and they talked for 3 hours. And at the end of the call, Diane said, I knew you weren't done. And Sara said, I wasn't sure. And Diane said, I know. That's why I didn't say it until now. She watered the cactus before she left. It looked at her with the same indifference it always had, which she appreciated, because indifference from the cactus had always been oddly reliable. The training position was at Fort Garron, 40 miles east of Delwick, which meant she did not have to relocate and did not have to decide what relocating would mean. She drove it the first day, early, before the commuter traffic, and the city passed on either side of the bypass, and the morning was flat and gray and ordinary, and she drove through it thinking about 11 months of double shifts and paper cups of coffee, and the particular weight of a life that has been made smaller than it should be by a combination of external pressure and internal agreement. She had agreed to be small. She understood that now with more clarity than she had 4 weeks ago. Not because she had been weak. Weakness wasn't the right frame, but because the machinery that had pressured her out had been designed to make her doubt her own dimensions. And for 4 years, it had mostly worked. She had taken the smallness and called it discretion and called it adaptation and called it starting over. And some of it had been those things, legitimately. But some of it had been the slow, daily acceptance of less than what she was. And the acceptance had compounded the way small acceptances do. Until 11 months in Delwick, it had looked like a life. It had been a waiting room. She knew what waiting rooms felt like now, in a way she hadn't before she'd sat in one for that long, and she thought that knowing was worth something, even if the price had been high. Fort Garron was 40 miles, and she drove it in 45 minutes and arrived before anyone else because she always arrived before anyone else. And she sat in the parking area outside the training facility with the engine off and the early morning quiet around her, and thought about Ramirez, about Martinez, recovering at Walter Reed, about the 3 names that were the 3 who hadn't come home. She said those names in her head, which she did sometimes, privately, because names were what she had instead of ceremony, and because the ceremony that should have happened never had. And she was not the kind of person who needed ceremony except when the absence of it was an injustice. And this had been an injustice. The injustice was finally being corrected. It would not bring anyone back. It would not undo the 4 years of accumulated smallness, or the convoy attack, or the syringe in the secondary port, or any of the sequence of events that had moved through her life like a fault line, running underground, invisible until the ground shifted. Reston would face trial, and so would Vrabel, and so would Carver, and the proceedings would be long and federal, and would receive the kind of coverage that such proceedings receive, significant and then receding, the public attention span moving on while the legal machinery continued at its own pace. She would testify. She had already been told what that would involve, and had said yes without the pause that some people expected, because saying yes was the next task, and the next task was what she did. None of the correct outcomes were clean. They were correct. That was what they were. She got out of the car. Okafor was leaning against the building entrance with a coffee cup, which she was beginning to understand was his natural state. Coffee, low-key positioning, waiting with the relaxed patience of someone who had learned that showing up early was its own form of saying something. "You're here," he said. "Obviously. I wasn't sure you'd take it." "I wasn't sure either." She stopped beside him. He handed her the second coffee he had, which she took. "How's the posting?" "Good. Garrison's team did a full network clearance on the base security staff after the arrests. The CO is solid." He paused. "The trainees are green. They need someone who's worked real emergencies." "They're going to have that." He looked at her sideways. Not the way someone looks at a superior. She was not technically his superior in this role, which was civilian contracted, a distinction that was functionally administrative. The way someone looks at a person they have taken a measure of over the past difficult weeks and have come to a conclusion about. "They don't know who you are yet," he said. "The trainees. They just know a civilian contractor is coming in to run the advanced trauma module." "Good," she said. "They're going to figure it out." "They'll figure it out by watching," she said, "not by being told." She drank the coffee. "That's how it works." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "it is." She looked at the building. Concrete, functional. The architecture of a place designed for use rather than impression. Inside it were 18 trainees who would become medics, who would go forward into situations that did not announce themselves, who would have to make decisions in 12 seconds that they would carry for years, and who needed to learn that competence was not a performance, and panic was a management problem, and the distance between someone dying and someone living was sometimes one set of trained hands that didn't wait for permission. She had been those hands. She could teach that. Not the comfort of it. There was no comfort, and anyone who told them otherwise was lying. But the fact of it. That training existed for the moment when training was the only thing between your patient and the worst outcome. That the work was worth doing even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. She had spent 4 years being nobody watching. She understood the value of that better than most people she would ever stand in front of. The door opened. She went inside. The trial of Edward Rustin began 11 weeks later and lasted 6 days. The proceedings were covered by 3 national outlets and 1 military affairs publication, and the coverage was factual and comprehensive and included in a sidebar that ran in the second day's reporting Sara's name, her full name, Captain Sara Malone, with her rank restored and her commendations listed, identified as the primary witness whose preserved documentation had provided the evidential link between Reston and Vrabel that the prosecution built its central case around. She read the sidebar once. Then she went back to what she was doing, which was reviewing the training module for week 4, which was not glamorous and was exactly right. Vrabel pled guilty on the 4th day of Reston's trial, the lawyers working out the arithmetic of what cooperation would buy him versus what a contested verdict might cost him, and the calculation came out where it usually came out when the evidence was comprehensive and the alternative was worse. He was 61 and had traded his career and the last of whatever reputation he had built for the money Reston had paid him, and he was now trading what remained of his freedom for a number on a sentencing recommendation. And Sara read that in the same military affairs publication and felt something that was not satisfaction exactly, but was adjacent to it. The adjacent to satisfaction feeling that comes when something that was wrong for a long time is formally acknowledged as wrong, even if the acknowledgement arrives in the dry language of a plea agreement. Carver went to trial separately, 3 weeks after Reston's verdict. He maintained through his attorneys that his role had been coordination and that coordination was not conspiracy. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and disagreed. The verdict was returned on a Tuesday afternoon, and Sara was in a training session when Okafor's text came through, which she read during the break and then put her phone back in her pocket and went back to the session. The trainee she had been working with, a 22-year-old named Briggs, who had good instincts and a tendency to second-guess them, which was the specific combination she spent the most time on because it was the combination that was hardest to correct and most important to correct, was waiting for her at the simulation station. "Where were we?" Sara said. "Airway assessment," Briggs said. "Displaced trachea. I got the diagnosis right, but I hesitated on the needle." "Why?" "Because I wasn't—" She stopped. Started again. "Because I wasn't sure." "You don't need to be sure," Sara said. "Sure isn't the standard. Sure takes too long. The standard is my assessment supported by the signs in front of me? If yes, you move." She paused. "You were right. You had the right answer. You just didn't trust it." Briggs looked at the simulation mannequin. "How do you learn to trust it?" Sara thought about a trauma bay in the middle of a surge with 12 people watching and a general on the table and a surgeon who couldn't get the angle, and about the 4 seconds between stepping forward and the moment the tube went in, and about whether trust was the right word for what had been happening in those 4 seconds, which was more like the absence of the question rather than the presence of the answer. "You learn that the hesitation costs more than the action," she said. "Eventually that becomes the thing you trust. Not your certainty, your training." She paused. "And then you move." Briggs picked up the needle. She moved. It wasn't perfect. The angle was slightly off, and Sara corrected it with 2 fingers, the same way she had corrected Park's angle in the trauma bay on a Tuesday that felt like a long time ago and was not, in the calendar, that long ago at all. Briggs adjusted, and the placement was correct, and the simulation registered it, and Briggs exhaled. "Again," Sara said. Briggs went again. This was the work. Not the dramatic version. Not the convoy and the syringe and the stairwell and the 4 years of documents in a waterproof case in a storage unit on the east side of a city she had arrived in quiet and was leaving something different. That version existed and was real and had cost what it cost. But this version was also the work, maybe more essentially the work, because the other version was what happened when this version hadn't happened yet for enough people. Every set of hands she trained was a reduction in the number of moments like the one in that trauma bay. Every time she said again and meant it and stayed, she was doing what she had not been allowed to do for 4 years, which was exist at the size she actually was. She was done being smaller, not because the world had finally recognized her. Recognition was partial and late and administered in the form of army letters and legal verdicts and the specific, imperfect processes of institutions correcting themselves, none of which arrived cleanly, but because she had stopped consenting to the reduction, Because the 4 years and the 11 months and the sealed envelope and the go bag beside the door had taught her something that no training module covered and no commendation captured. That the people who underestimate you are not your measure. They are only your obstacle. And obstacles are what you move through on the way to doing the work. You do not wait to be recognized to begin. You begin. And if you're quiet enough and steady enough, and you keep your hands trained and your record sealed and your go bag on the floor where it belongs, eventually the moment arrives when the room goes dark and the lights come back on and everything that was hidden is simply, finally, visible. And you are still there, still standing, still exactly who you always were.